Greetings and salutations. Welcome to our service at the Jackson Street Church of Christ. Glad that you could be here. Here's what we're going to talk about tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about something that I think is very, very important. Something that I often need a reminder of, and perhaps you do as well. And it's a reminder of who really, really is in charge in this world and in our lives and of all we do. Who's the judge? Who's the one that we go to for answers? When I think about judges, or when I think about someone who has the final say or the final rule, it really is important to have those things. You know, if there's a football game and there was no official and it were left to the players or the coaches to meet amongst themselves and to decide whether that was holding or not, or whether that was pass interference, or whether he actually crossed the line of scrimmage or entered into the end zone, how well do you think that would go? Even with video evidence, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be able to get past the first quarter of any football game. People would argue and argue and argue and argue and argue because there was no one there to give a final rule or a final say, who didn't care or supposed to not care which team benefited from it, but is simply there to look at what's right and look at what's wrong and to make sure the game can progress smoothly and efficiently without having to stop constantly for arguments and all of those things. That's one of the great benefits of having judges or officials. I mean, imagine in a court of law if there were no judge and there were no jury. It were simply up to the one accused of committing the crime and perhaps the victim of the crime to decide for themselves, have a long conversation to come to some agreement. Is he innocent or is he guilty? What should his punishment be? You know, those types of things would never work. You need someone with a final say. And we can come up with a bunch of examples of things in this life where it's helpful to have for somebody to have a final say. But the reality is, in the grand scheme of things and on the whole of it all, there's only one who has ultimate, true, everlasting authority, and that's God and his son Jesus, who he gave authority to. One of the things that you see at the end of the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus, at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, promises that the promises that he will be Emmanuel, which is God with us. Right? And then at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, he says, I will be with you always, even till the end of the age. And so the story of Matthew is largely how God came to be with his people and how he began to rule. At the beginning of Matthew, he's just this baby, and there's this promise of the king of the Jews that's coming that gets Herod really, really scared, and he doesn't know what this is going to mean for him, and so he has babies killed, and he does all this evil stuff. But at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, you see Jesus is given a crown. You see that he is given a plaque that says the King of the Jews. You see that he is given a robe. You see that he is proclaimed the King of the Jews. Now, we know that all of those things were done in a rather superficial way as he was actually being crucified, but he was enthroned in the most unique and unexpected ways possible. And at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, before he says, I will be with you always, he says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go into all nations and preach the gospel. Or make disciples. What he's saying is, after his enthroning death and his victorious resurrection, Jesus is the one who is God with us. Jesus is the one who is King of all the nations. All authority, both in heaven and on earth, is found in Christ. And so you can make disciples of every nation. It doesn't matter who the king of that nation is, because the true one with all authority is Jesus Christ. That's a powerful and important reminder. And I think it's an important thing to keep in your mind, that early Christian concept of Jesus as the ruler of all things, when we get to our main passage for this evening, which will be Colossians chapter 1. In Colossians chapter 1, you have Paul writing to a confused and in some ways scandalized church at Colossae, who is inundated with all kinds of different philosophies and worldviews and ideas and doctrines and teachings from all these different directions. Sometimes people call it the Colossian heresy, because it's hard to specifically pin down exactly what the problem is, so you kind of define it in a rather vague way. It's just the big heresy that was going on there. But when you look at Colossians, you see all kinds of things. You see him talk about philosophies of men. You see him talk about asceticism, worshiping angels. You see him talking about the law of Moses and people judging them for not keeping Sabbaths and new moons. And you know what you do in a pluralistic society where you have all kinds of people from all kinds of worldviews with all kinds of experiences, all telling you different things. This is right and this is wrong and this is what you should do. And other people telling you conflicting things that are right and wrong and what you should do. You know what's really, really helpful to have? A judge who will be the one who ultimately determines what's really right and what's really wrong. To have an official, to have a judge, to have one who truly has all authority in heaven and on earth. That's what Paul is trying to remind these Christians of. He's saying you're hearing all of these ideas. People are trying to persuade you with persuasive sounding arguments and doctrines, chapter 2 and verse 4. People are trying to take your mind captive with philosophies and traditions of men, chapter 2 and verse 8. People are trying to disqualify you of your prize because they have a vision in a temple, or because they worship angels, or because they practice asceticism, or because they say, do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, or because they observe new moon or Sabbath day, or certain feasts or certain foods. Like, all of these things are mentioned in the book of Colossians, and all of these people are telling them, this is what you want to do, and this is what you want to do. And what Paul is going to try to remind them, who really is in charge, who really is the king, and who really is the one who we ought to be listening to. I think that's a reminder that no matter what is going on in your life, no matter what time period you live in, and no matter who the rulers of your day are, no matter where you're living, it's always important reminder who ultimately says yes, who ultimately says no, who ultimately is the ruler and the judge of all things, and to serve that one. That one is Jesus Christ. And so in Colossians chapter 1, we're going to kind of read through the text a little bit and discuss it as we go, and hopefully bring out some helpful points before drawing our lesson to a close. But Paul is going to talk about what he prays for them about. There are certain things that I pray for Jackson Street for. I pray every single night for the church at Jackson Street. My wife can testify to that, because we pray together for Jackson Street every night. And there are certain things that I mention specifically every time. And then there are other things that I'll mention if a need arises, and I might mention it for a week or a month, and then I might not mention that, and I'll mention something else, because there are things that come and things that go. Right now, there are things I'm praying for Jackson Street about. I'm praying that we're able to meet together again soon. I'm praying that when we do, it's a peaceful meeting, and that everyone is able to get along. People miss each other, and even though there might be different opinions on things, I hope we can have patience with each other, patience through this whole ordeal, and we can have a nice, healthy reunion when the time comes. There are a lot of things that I pray for Jackson Street about. I pray that we're evangelistic. I pray that people in our community will look to us as a light, a beacon of generosity, but also of truth and of holiness and of connection with God. Like, there are things that I want Jackson Street to be. I think Paul's the same way. With all the churches that he writes to, with all the churches that he actually planted or that he has relationship with, or the church in Colossae where he's writing and it doesn't appear that he's actually seen them face to face, there are things that he's concerned about for that church. Sometimes it comes from some message that he heard that someone brought him or whatever, but there are things that he prays for them for. And when you hear someone praying for a church, the things that they mention in that prayer are probably their deepest concerns for that church. I know that's the case with me. I bet that's the case with Paul also. And so listen to some of these things that he prays for. Chapter 1, verse 9. For this reason also, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you and to ask that, and here's what he's going to tell us, you be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. All right, that's an important thing. If you're talking to people who are hearing all kinds of different ideas and the will of all kinds of different people, he says, I want you to have his will. I want you to have spiritual wisdom in discerning it and understanding and knowing what it is. Verse 10, so that, and here's the reason why, you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects. Like, I want you to walk in such a way that you are pleasing God and honoring him with the steps that you take. These are the types of things that he mentions. Number 1, bearing fruit in every good work, So I want you to know his will so that you can bear fruit in his works and in his kingdom and in his vineyard. You can do the things that produce for him and for his kingdom. Number 2, and increasing in the knowledge of God. I want there to be less confusion when you think about God rather than more confusion. I want you to increase in knowledge. One of the great ways to combat confusion from all sorts of different directions is to know God more deeply and more sincerely and more truly. And then verse 11, number 3, he wants them to be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might for the attaining of the steadfastness and patience. So he wants them to be strong. That's something that's required during times where your patience is tested. He wants them to be strong so that they can be steadfast and patient. In verse 11 is what he says. And then finally, verse 11 and 12 talks about and joyously giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. All right, so the final things is I want you to not only bear fruit and increase in knowledge and to be strengthened so that you can have patience with one another and patience through tribulation, but also I want you to be people who joyously give thanks. How long has it been, really, since you have joyously given thanks for who you are in Christ, for what God has done for you, for the life that you're now living? It's healthy to do it. Sometimes we think we should give thanks when we feel like it, and we feel like it when things are going good. I think one of the mindsets that Paul works hard to adopt and to promote is joyously give thanks and rejoice always, whether things are good or things are bad. Because if you rejoice when things are bad, rejoicing and giving thanks itself will remind you of better things, of a hope that perhaps it's easy to forget about sometimes. It'll remind you of things that you can be positive and thankful for. So one of his goals is for them to rejoice and to give thanks joyously always, right? And then he mentions that you're giving thanks to the Father, and then he tells us something about the Father that's really important. Who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light? No one else can do that. You realize that, right? No one else who tells you anything, no one else who gives you any idea, any philosophy, any worldview, no one else can qualify you. Who's the one who qualifies or disqualifies at a sporting event? Who's the one who makes those final decisions as to what's right and what is wrong? I started off this lesson by saying it's helpful to have those people. Well, in life, the one who qualifies us to share in his inheritance with the saints and with the holy ones in his glorious light is God. Right? This world is in the realm and in the domain of darkness, right? But God has holy ones who are light, and he allows us to be qualified to share with them, to participate with them, to be part of the light of this world. And so when he does that, he's done something really remarkable for us. He's actually taken us from the darkness of this world and transferred us into where there is light. Paul's going to go on to describe that in verse 13. It says, "For he rescued us. No one else can rescue you, but God can rescue you. He rescued us from the domain or the realm of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." Remember, I mentioned at the beginning, the end of Matthew, where Jesus says, all authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. He's king of heaven and earth. He's the king of kings. That's not given to Caesar. That's not given to any local kings. It's not given to Herod, who at the beginning of Matthew was really worried that he was going to lose his job as king of the Jews. Jesus is the one who is now king, having all authority in heaven and on earth. And God is the one who took us from darkness and brought us into that kingdom of light, brought us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. The idea of the kingdom is the reign and the rule of God. It's where God is in charge, where God rules, where God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven, and that's what we get to be a part of. That's what God has transferred us to. And when you are in that kingdom, when you're in that light, you have this tremendous blessing. You have, verse 14, redemption and forgiveness of sins. He has purchased you back from the world to be his own, and he has forgiven you of everything that you have ever done. You now walk in light as one of his holy ones. That's a wonderful, beautiful idea that you can joyously give thanks about. So when he says joyously give thanks to the Father who qualified us, how did he do that? He did it by giving you an inheritance with the saints, because he took you from the power of darkness and he transferred you into the kingdom of his beloved Son. It's a wonderful thing to be a part of God's church. It's a wonderful thing to be a part of his holy community in Christ. And that's what he's done for you that, by the way, no one else can. That is unique to God's rule and reign in this world. He's the one who can forgive. He's the one who has plans for you. He's the one who can give you redemption and forgiveness of sins. Right? And so, having done this, he goes on to give this little description of who Jesus is, the one whose kingdom we've been transferred into. He says in verse 15 that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. That's a really important description of Jesus, and I think there's two really important ideas that we should think about when we consider Jesus being the image of the invisible God. One is that God is invisible, and so we don't have an image of God that we can see. You can't look up to the sky and see a face smiling or anything like that. So what does God look like? He actually does have an image that we're to look to, and we're told that that image is Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God. So when you look to Jesus, you're getting a picture of who God is. But think about that phrase, the image of the invisible God. Who was created to be in the image of God? We were. If you read Genesis, like the creation account, which, by the way, he's going to move on from this to start talking about creation. In verse 15, he mentions the image of God and creation, saying he's the firstborn of all creation, right? So he's the image of God, and he's the one who created things. So that shows us that he's in the role of God. But again, think about that. Who was created to be in God's image? We were. So he's not only the perfect image of God, he is fulfilling the role that we as humans were created to be, images of God. But Jesus is the one who perfectly shows us what the image of God is. So Jesus is not only perfectly God, but he's perfectly human. Like, he shows us what the ideal man God created is supposed to be. You're supposed to look to Jesus and you see the image of God. But you're also seeing what human beings from creation were intended to be, which are images of God. And so Jesus perfectly fulfills what he was created to be as a human, but he also fulfills the role of God that he has in eternity. So you can see Jesus as God. You can also see Jesus as part of God's creation. You can also see like the man Jesus as part of God's creation, who is perfectly showing us what humanity is to look like also. And so he is called the firstborn over God's creation, or all God's creation. Why is he called that? Because he is greater than anything that has ever been created. He has first status over all created things. How can he have first status over all created things? Well, if you look at verse 15 through 17, you get a quick couple of reasons why. Verse 16 says, "For by him, by Jesus, all things were created." So how can he be greater than every created thing? He's the one who created everything. All things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth. By the way, I want you to remember the phrase, we're going to come back to it in just a second. All things, and in heaven and on earth. All things in heaven and on earth. That's talking about everything God created, right? Things in heaven, like spiritual beings, whether they're visible or invisible, and things on the earth, like all the stuff that we see. Everything in heaven, everything on earth, created by Jesus. So he goes on to say, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible or invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. So he actually starts mentioning like thrones and rulers. Well, there are thrones and rulers on earth, clearly. There are also thrones and rulers in the heavenly realms. And Jesus is the one who created and rules them all. So Caesar's throne, you would say, well, Caesar's in charge, right? No. that throne is subservient to Jesus. And it may be disobedient, but it's still underneath the rule of Jesus. Or you can mention like the principalities and the heavenly hosts, and those in the same way are in subjection or underneath, farther lower than the authority and the power of Jesus, because he's the one who created them all. All things, is that phrase again, have been created through him and for him. Verse 17, he is before all things. So Jesus existed before anything else ever did. He existed before anything was ever created, and he is in him all things hold together. The reason other things are even able to exist is because the power and the might of Jesus sustaining them. Verse 18, he is the head of the body, the church. All right, so that's this kingdom of light, this realm of people who have become a community who follows the rule of God. Jesus is the one who is the head of that. He is also the ruler, or he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. Jesus is the first to be raised to glory. There are people who came back to life before Jesus, but he's the first one, has the greatest resurrection, and he has the resurrection from which he will never die again. So that, and this is kind of a conclusion, talking about the glory of Jesus, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. So you name it, Jesus is the one who's greater than it and in charge and the ruler of it. He is the one who has first place in everything. What is it that causes you stress right now in your life? What is it that you don't understand? What is it that you wish were different? What is it that you're striving for in the future? What is it you regret about your past? What is it that is going on for any person anywhere in this world at any time, whether visible or invisible? You know who actually is the one who you should go to for all of those things? The one who can actually solve all of those things? The one who actually is the ruler over heavens and the earth? It's Jesus. He's the one who created all things. He's before all things. In him, all things hold together. Whether they are in heaven or they are on earth, Jesus is the ruler of all. And what's God's plan as Jesus being the ruler of all of these things? Some of these things seem to hate Jesus. Some of these things seem to, like you say, that's the will of God on earth. That doesn't look like the will of God on earth. Like some things are disobedient. Some of the thrones are clearly disobedient. Some of the rulers are disobedient, both heavenly and earthly. And so you look at it and you say, like, it doesn't seem like he's actually ruling all of these things. There's a lot of confusion right now in our world, right? So what's the ultimate plan here? If you keep reading, verse 19, it says, for it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness, the pleroma, to dwell in him. Like everything that is God dwells in Jesus. Verse 20, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of the cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. And so what he goes on to say is, at the cross, Jesus enacted something to reconcile all things to himself. Remember, we've been talking about the phrase all things, right? And you go back to verse 16. All things were created by him, things in heaven and things on earth. So all things God created, heaven and earth, right? And then verse 20, he's trying to reconcile all things to himself, things in heaven and things on earth. We're talking about the same list of things here, and it's all things. And so God's plan is for reconciliation through the cross of Jesus. All the things in this world that seem like they are out of sorts, God's plan through the cross is victory and reconciliation for all things, including you and me. And that's what he zeroes in on in verse 21. For although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, yet he has now reconciled you. All right, so you have been reconciled also in his fleshly body through death, in order to present you before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach. All right, so that's a really grand and cosmic way of saying he transferred you out of darkness and transferred you in, or he rescued you from darkness and transferred you into the realm of his beloved Son. You were in darkness, alienated, hostile in mind, but then through the death of Jesus, you were reconciled to God through his death in order to now be presented as blameless and holy and beyond reproach. You can't find blame. You can't reproach. You can't, you are now walking in holiness. That's what God has called us to be. And that's what God has transformed us to be and transferred us into. Verse 23 shows that this is all contingent. It says in verse 23, if indeed you continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you heard. This world can be kind of crazy sometimes, and there can be a lot of stuff that we don't have control over, but we know who does. And I don't know exactly how he maintains that control and what that's always going to look like and what he's going to do. I can't always predict it, and I certainly can't control it. But here's what I can do. I can, verse 23, continue in the faith firmly established. I can be steadfast and not moved away from the hope that I have through the gospel, the hope that I have through him. The key to all of this isn't to understand it all. It's not to have all of the answers. It's not to always pick and choose the exact right option before you. It's not to condemn those who don't. The key here is to stick as closely to Jesus as you possibly can. In times where you're confident, in times where you have doubts, in times where you understand, in times where you don't, in times where it's easy and in times where it's hard. Jesus never loses control, so stick with him. Be firmly within his grasp. Cling tightly to his hand and rejoice always to be part of his community, to be part of his church, to be within his reign in his kingdom. I hope that you'll remember that. I hope that it'll be beneficial to you and a blessing to you. I love you, and may the love of God be with you.